Page 339 continued. Dramatists of the problem play. Para. T.W. Robertson, Henry Arthur Jones, and Sir Arthur Wing Pinero did much to prepare the ground for the new drama of ideas and social purpose. The appearance in 1865 of the Society, a play by T.W. Robertson, was a portent. His name is associated with the beginning of the modern revival of English drama. He was one of the forerunners of the realistic drama, which became so popular in the 90s. After the staging of Society, Robertson wrote some other plays, namely Hours, O-U-R-S, Cast, C-A-S-T-E, Play, School, and M-Stop, P-Stop, Stop. In all of them, the stage was used for the presentation and discussion of some social problem. Thus, there came about the combination of the play of ideas with realistic production and a new attitude to the theatre. Para. Arthur Wing Pinero, 1855 to 1934. A-R-T-H-U-R, Arthur Wing, W-I-N-G, Pinero, P-I-N-E-R-O. Arthur Wing Pinero and Henry Arthur Jones carried on to a further stage the work begun by Robertson. Pinero's famous play, The Second Mrs. Tamqueray, T-A-M-Q-U-E-R-A-Y, 1893, poses the question of the social acceptance of the woman with a, quote, past, unquote, stop. Pinero's play comes to the sad conclusion that as matters stand, such a woman cannot be admitted to polite society. Realizing that no redemption is possible from her past scenes, Paula Tanqueray, Tanqueray, kills herself. This play, when first produced at St. James Theatre, London, on May 27, 1893, was hailed as epoch-making, and Pinero was recognized as, quote, a brilliant and daring pioneer, unquote, of the new dramatic revival. Para. Henry Arthur Jones, 1851 to 1929. Henry Arthur Jones believed that the drama should provide social criticism. He began a light probing at Victorian convention as early as the 80s with Breaking a Butterfly, 1885, based on Ibsen's A Doll's House, 1879. He further produced Saints and Sinners, 1891, The Crusaders, 1893, and The Case of Rebellious Susan, 1894. In the case of Rebellious Susan, he presents a respectable married lady, rebels against her unfaithful husband, and sails too close to the wind in an unfortunate flirtation. The play is based on the general problem of matrimonial stability and the mutual obligations of husbands and wives. In spite of its conservative approach to the problem of conjugal disharmony and crudities of technique, the play to some extent paved the way for the more artistic and outspoken works of Galsworthy, Granville Baker, and George Bernard Shaw. Para. George Bernard Shaw, 1856 to 1950. George Bernard Shaw had the longest career in English dramatic history, for his first play, Widowers' Houses, was staged as early as 1892, and his most recent work, Good King Charles's Golden Days, appeared in 1939. He was a moralist and propagandist. He was one of the earliest to advocate the new social drama of Ibsen. A.C. Ward says, quote, he was impressed by tile, single quote, technical novelty, unquote, of Ibsen's plays Cologne, by his judgments upon ideals and idealists, semicolon, and by his anti-romantic impatience of the womanly woman, unquote, stop. In his several plays, Shaw dealt with the various social problems: slum landlords, prostitution, marriage conventions, the medical profession, social prejudices, the romanticized soldier are some of the themes that passed through the microscope of his rationalism. Para. Shaw's first play, Widowers' Houses, 1892, was, quote, an economic tract in dramatic form, unquote, but it failed on the stage. He won little recognition until he began to publish his plays in 1898. His collection of 7 plays, Plays Pleasant and Unpleasant, appeared in 1898, in which he voiced his ideas on many a social problem. In Mrs. Warren's Profession, 1894, he deals with the social and economic aspects of prostitution. The play is based on the flinty facts of social economics, and Shaw boldly faces the ugliness and brutality of life. The play emphasizes 2 or 3 distinct ideas. Shaw is convinced that prostitution is caused, quote, not by female depravity and men licentiousness, unquote, but by the poverty and drudgery to which women are generally condemned. Page 340. He ignored the psychological aspects of the problem and the class of women who resort to prostitution for the sake of variety and excitement. The play also emphasizes the idea of tainted wealth. Incidentally, the play refers to the emancipation of the, quote, new woman, unquote, and also raises the problem of the relation between parents and children. Para. Arms and the Man, 1894, is a satire on the military. Shaw stripped war and heroism of all their romantic glamour and set forth what he regarded as the essential truth about them. It professes to be, quote, an anti-romantic play, unquote, stop. The exposition scene with its surprises, its suspense, its touches of fancy is enough to show the skill of Shaw. Yet at the time it was thought shocking because of his unromantic treatment of war and soldiering. Yeats admired and hated it. Quote, it seemed to me, unquote, he said, quote, inorganic, logical straightness, and not the crooked path of life, unquote, stop, para. In Candida, 1895, which owes much to Ibsen's influence, attacks the institution of marriage, gives a new meaning to, quote, the eternal triangle, unquote, and champions woman's freedom. The play is a serious comedy and deals with a social problem in a serious spirit. The dramatist's dissatisfaction with the orthodox views on matrimony and the status of women is clearly revealed, quote, in Candida, unquote, says S.C. Sengupta, quote, Shaw attacks the economic system of society in its greatest and most popular institution marriage, stop. Marriage is founded on a sexual contract between man and woman and the economic slavery of the latter, stop. That is why Candida is not only an economic but also a sex drama, stop. In Getting Married, a disquisitory play, the characters only talk about the problem of marriage, but in Candida, a real drama of passion and action, they face it. Candida's husband, James Mavor, M-A-V-O-R, Morell, M-O-R-E-L-L, is esteemed in society as a highly respectable gentleman, and in private life he is an ideal husband, intensely devoted to his wife, who is treasured to him. But it is gradually revealed to him in the course of the normal incidents of a normal day, that he is a parasite on his wife's work, that it is she who has to do all the irritating drudgery of the household, so that he may keep fit and get leisure for his noble mission of preaching Christianity and socialism. Stop. It is on this serio-comic discovery that the interest of the drama hinges. Stop, unquote. Para. Shaw's plays are designed to serve as vehicles for his ideas as he explores every known problem, social, moral, political, and religious, in his plays. The idea of Shaw's witty observations relegate plot and character into a secondary position into our mind, but quite often his situations are full of drama and suspense. The dialogue is witty and realistic, and some of his characters are highly interesting. The idea is important in his plays, though most of his plays exhibit most of the qualities of a good play. In this connection, G.S. Fraser says, quote, his plays are not only a series of lively and entrancing performances, but a kind of running commentary on the burning topics and leading ideas of the age, unquote. Stop. The ideas of Shaw revolve about three basic notions. One, that man through his voluntary efforts is capable of controlling his own destiny with intelligence, common sense. Two, that 19th century women were deprived by convention from the exercise of their full powers of initiative and genius. Three, that civilization had sold itself into a slavish adulation of science and medical men, and the mumbo-jumbo that had grown around men of science and doctors, making something of demigods out of them. Para. John Galsworthy, 1867 to 1933. Galsworthy occupies a distinctive place in modern English drama. His naturalism reminds us of Ibsen. In his moral earnestness he is akin to Shaw, and in his preoccupation with the source and disease of society he resembles Breux, B-R-I-E-U-X. He is a critic and interpreter of contemporary English life in his dramas. The tendency to probe the source, S-O-R-E-S, of society characterize serious modern drama in general, but Galsworthy's diagnosis and his suggested treatment are his own. Like Shaw, he handles definite problems, those of marriage, of sex relationship, of labor dispute, of the administration of the law, of solitary confinement, of caste feeling or class prejudice, but for him the individual problem always leads to the fundamental problem of the general relation between individuals within these social organisms. He does not seek to represent the universal human emotions, the problems of life, love, hate, world-weariness, ambition, etc., as Shakespeare did. These great themes do not engage the mind of Galsworthy. His vision is narrowed down to the social problems of his own country and age. His chosen material is contemporary life in its everyday aspects. He is wedded to the actual. His dramas are like a tree which springs from the seeding of a thought or idea. Each play is built on a frame of ideas. Page 344. In this connection, G.S. Fraser says, Quote, Galsworthy's plays are carefully constructed and very well-meaning, but one is too much aware all the time, when reading them or watching them of the author's intention to present an example and state a case, stop unquote, para. John Galsworthy, Galsworthy, came to the theatre with The Silver Box, 1906, and for a quarter of a century produced a number of dramas on current social problems. The Silver Box deals with the inequality of justice. We see how the majesty of the law may end in a horrible human mistake because social thinking does not allow for individual circumstances. The play attacks a social justice which will mete out punishment to a poor man and free a rich man for the same crime. Galsworthy shows that law favors the rich and penalizes the poor. The former are easily able to escape from its clutches, but the latter are helpless and cannot defend themselves. Jack and Jones are both guilty of theft, but whereas Jack escapes censure, Jones is sentenced to a month's hard labor. When the sentence is announced, Jones mutters angrily, quote, "Call this justice? Question mark. What about him?" That is him, question mark. Single quote, "He got drunk!" Exclamation mark. He took the purse, but it is his money that got him off justice! Exclamation unquote, para. Strife, 1909, deals with the struggle between capital and labor. It treats of the sentiment of a long-standing strike that has been going on at the Trenarth, Trenarth Works, WORKS. It has lasted all winter, the workers are almost at the end of their tether, and the company's resources have been sadly depleted. The chances of compromise have been wrecked by two strong and inflexible men, John Anthony and David Roberts. The play is a precious human document as well as a scathing criticism of the prevailing social order and its internal schisms and rivalries. H.V. Routh, R-O-U-T-H, says, quote, "Strife, 1909, leaves the logic of facts to convince us that fanaticism and inflexibility alike overreach themselves in a society which ought to thrive on mutual understanding, especially in trade disputes, stop unquote, para. Justice 1910 is a stern condemnation of the contemporary legal system. It attacks the evils of prison system, especially the solitary confinement. It involves the tragic suicide of William Falder, a young lawyer's clerk, as a result of the unjust and continued cruelty with which he is treated for the commission of a minor crime. Justice is a powerful plea for sympathetic treatment of lawbreakers. The play made a tremendous impression and led to a substantial reduction of the period of solitary confinement prescribed by law. Para. Harley, Harley, Granville, Granville-Barker, Barker, 1877-1946. Harley Granville Barker made a vital contribution to the problem play. He was one of the first of this age to study spiritual aimlessness for its own sake. He dramatized the individual who cannot easily adjust his inner self to his outward life. This individual encounters no barriers nor pitfalls worth conquering, but on the other hand, no encouraging opportunities for his better self, merely a spiritual void. His themes include the marriage conventions, the inheritance of tainted money, sex, and position of women. His significant problem plays are the Voysey, Voysey inheritance, 1905, Waste, 1907, and the Madras House, 1909. The Voysey inheritance, which was his best play, is concerned with a young lawyer carrying on his father's frauds for protecting the honor of the family. In Waste, he showed the tragic consequences of violating the moral code of society. The playwright sets forth the disaster wrought in the life of a brilliant politician by his sexual indiscretion with a chance acquaintance. It ends in the death of a brilliant young politician. His secretary, Walter Kent, exclaims, quote, "I am angry, just angry at the waste of a good man, They have lost him and wasted him, damn them, ! With his work all undone, ! Who's to do it, ? Oh, the waste of him, Oh, the waste, the waste, ! The Madras House, 1910, is an exposure of suburban and commercial life, both domestic and professional. In this play, he also examines the problem of sex relations and, quote, portraits the thwarted lives of women at the beginning of the century, unquote, The problem drama of England was unquestionably the fruit of a strong dissatisfaction with the existing conditions of life. It directed attention to the facts and problems of social life, and depicted the misery and suffering wrought by the cruel forces and conventions of society. The problem playwright censured the existing social system, its rigid laws and straight-laced codes, STRAIGHT, codes of conduct and belief. Some of the problem plays proved so effective that they imbued men with a passionate resentment against social justice. Justice mobilized public opinion in favor of prison reform and hastened legislative action. Similarly, Clemence Dane's A Bill of Divorcement led to the recognition of a persistent certified lunacy as 342, one of the grounds for divorce. No doubt the problem plays were produced in large number, but since 1920 its supremacy came to be challenged by the revival of the historical and imaginative drama, and above all the poetical drama and the experimental play. Section Trends in Modern Literary Criticism. The 20th century witnessed a terrific deluge of literary criticism. Scarcely a day passed when quite a sheaf of critical writing did not make its appearance. To impose some sort of pattern on this tremendous mass of writing, even for the sake of discussion, is a desperate attempt. Our ears are all too familiar with the bewildering cacophony of critical noises which are apt to overset our wits and defy all comprehension. Scarcely does a, quote, school, unquote, of literary criticism appear when it finds another ready to measure swords with it. Quote, literary criticism, unquote, says Douglas Bush, quote, which for over 2,000 years seemed to be a lighthouse, radiating a fairly steady beam, has in recent times become a Tower of Babel, or, to change the metaphor, a darkling plain where arrogant armies clash by night, unquote, However, on the side of credit, it has to be admitted that some of modern literary criticism is indeed rarely illuminating and does things undreamt of our ancestors, who were unpossessed of the unimpressive, even enough partly dubious, stock-in-trade of the average critic of today. Some general observations about 20th century English literary criticism may now be profitably made without, of course, losing sight of the fact that it pertinaciously defies all neat labeling or wholesale generalization. 1. First, we have to take cognizance of America, which contributed to the critical output of the 20th century more than even Britain. Many critical schools, such as T.S. Eliot, have sprung from the American soil. Many scholars of literature, notably some British professors, are rightly skeptical of the quality of much of American critical output, but credit cannot but be given to a good quantity of it. 2. Secondly, we have to take into account, to use Stanley E. Hymans, Hyman, Hyman's, Hyman''s words in The Armed Vision, quote, the organized use of non-literary techniques and bodies of knowledge to obtain insight into literature, unquote. The sciences of psychology, anthropology, sociology, semantics, linguistics, and even mathematics and such techniques as that of psychoanalysis were increasingly pressed into the service of literary criticism by many practitioners of this craft in the 20th century, with sometimes dazzling and as often baffling results. 3. Thirdly, we are all too well aware of the complexity of modern literary criticism, particularly of the American brand. Simplicity has, quote, simply, unquote, gone out of fashion. Even in creative literature, complexity has come to be reverenced and even relished. There is substance in Donald Davies' complaint. Quote, the one thing, unquote, says he, quote, that really distinguishes the critical pedantry of today is the high price set upon complexity, The more complex the work, the better. The many works of Wheat, distinguished for massive simplicity, directness of approach, and unaffected lucidity of language, are undervalued or complexity is put upon them, unquote. Chief trends and schools. The literary critics of the 20th century were mostly independent thinkers, yet they can be roughly classified into so many schools or groups. Some critics, however, stuck to more or less Victorian modes of criticism and therefore may not be called, quote, modern, unquote, or, quote, modernistic, unquote, and consequently ought not detain us here. This category of critics includes Saintsbury, Chesterton, and many others like them, who are always entertaining and now and then illuminating, but they seem unaware of the winds of change blowing across the age, necessitating a radical readjustment of values and attitudes. Let us confine our attention here to the truly, quote, modern, unquote, schools and critics of the 20th century. Novelty and variety. Modern literary criticism in England offers a bewildering variety of critical theory and practice. New discoveries in psychology, anthropology, sociology, etc. have brought about a revolution in critical methods, with the result that modern criticism is quite different from criticism in the 19th century. Critics like I. A. Richards, T.S. Eliot, Pierre Lewis, and William Empson have provided entirely new interpretations of old writers and presented them in an entirely new light. The full significance of their achievement is yet to be realized. Traditional criticism. However, at the turn of the century, there were two traditions: the Matthew Arnold tradition of intellectual, abstract, or scientific criticism, and the aesthetic, impressionistic tradition of Walter Pater, Pater, that held the day. Stop, page 343. While Arnold made, quote, high seriousness, unquote, and, quote, criticism of life, unquote, the tests of poetry, Pater's criticism, aesthetic or impressionistic. While Arnold made art subservient to life, Pater advocated the theory of, quote, art for art's sake, unquote, stop. Arnold's influence was an all-pervasive and a continuing one. That is why Eliot once remarked that we seem still to be living in the critical tradition of Arnold. Pater, on the other hand, has been a source of inspiration for the, quote, Bloomsbury group, unquote, of critics, as E. M. Forster, Virginia Woolf, Lytton Strachey, and Clive Bell. According to these critics, the enjoyment of art and the appreciation of beauty is the greatest good for human life, and art therefore must be freed from the shackles of morality. Their criticism is impressionistic. They assess a work of literature on the basis of the pleasure that it affords them. Academic criticism. These two traditions continued into the 20th century and were a constant source of inspiration. But in the opening years of the century, we do not find any original critic with a definite and individual point of view. Literary criticism is largely academic, the work of distinguished university professors. They are eminent scholars. They painstakingly collect facts, biographical, historical, and social, and evaluate a writer on the basis of these facts, but they lack a precise point of view. Chief among these scholar critics are George Stainsbury, Edward Dowden, Dowden, A. C. Bradley, Oliver Elton, W. B. Kerr, Ker, and W. J. Courthope, Courthope. There is another group of scholars who devote their attention to textual emendation. Distinguished scholars like Furness, Furness, Dover Wilson, Gregg, Gregg, and Pollard try to reach an authentic version of old texts. T. E. Hume, Hulme, the only original critic, one who has had considerable influence on T. S. Eliot, as also on the whole course of criticism in the modern age, is T. E. Hume. His point of view is religious, classical, and tragic. With the existentialist, he believes that tragedy is the central fact of human life. That is, and has always been, the human predicament. Man has always suffered, and this suffering arises from his own imperfections. Man is imperfect and finite, while God is perfect and infinite. Two conclusions follow from man's imperfection and finitude. Since man is imperfect, inspiration alone is not a safe guide, and since he is finite, he can never achieve the perfection and the finitude which belongs to non-human or the supernal. In this way, he at once rejects both the romantic concept of poetry as inspiration and the Victorian and Darwinian faith in unlimited progress. Thus, his point of view is anti-romantic and anti-humanistic. He advocates the need of order and discipline, and thus becomes a champion of, quote, classical revival unquote in literature, which Eliot also advocates. Further, Hume pointed out that poetry should express the vague, fleeting impressions passing through the mind of the poet, and this can only be done when the verse forms is made loose and flexible. He thus became a powerful advocate of verse libre, or free verse stock. He also advocates that the poet should express his concepts through the use of solid, concrete, and clear images, and in this way he became a source of inspiration to Ezra Pound and other poets of the Imagist school. Foreign influences. After the First World War, English insularity was broken, and ideas and influences from Europe began to flow in and affect the course of literary criticism in England. First, there was the influence of Marx and his concept of class struggle. Writers were analyzed and interpreted in terms of class conflict. For example, David Deutsch, in his book Society and Literature, shows how economic trends are reflected in literature. Christopher Caldwell, Caudwell, studies Shakespeare, Milton, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and the other romantics against the background of social and economic changes. Aestheticism of Pater is thus rejected, and literature is viewed as a social activity reflecting the changing social and economic patterns. Expressionism, surrealism, surrealism. Second, there was the potent influence of the Italian critic Benedetto Croce, Croce. According to his theory, vivid pictures are constantly rising in the mind of the poet, and he must express them spontaneously and fully as they arise in his mind, without any attempt at organization. This is known as expressionism. Expressionistic writing is bound to be broken and fragmentary, in keeping with the fragmentary and chaotic nature of the vague sensations fleeting through the consciousness of the poet. The teaching of Croce had a far-reaching impact on creative and literary activity in England. Closely allied with expressionism is the French theory of surrealism. Surrealism attributes artistic creation of dreams and the influence of spirits, page 344, who inspire the artist with his forms and images. Herbert Reed is one of those critics whose works reveal the influence of this creed. The psychologists. These influences were joined in and strengthened by the teachings of modern psychology, especially those of Freud, Jung, and Bergson. Freud believed that suppression of the sex instinct results in frustration and neurosis, and art is but a sublimated expression of this neurosis. Psychological theories were used for an analysis and interpretation of past writers and their works. Thus, Hamlet has been interpreted in the light of Freud's theory of the Oedipus complex, Oedipus. The motives and processes that lead to a particular work of art were studied, and thus new dimensions were added to literary criticism. Similarly, the impact of literature on the mind of the readers is sought to be explained in psychological terms. I. A. Richards is the most outstanding of the critics of the psychological school. According to him, the pleasure of literature arises from the fact that it brings about a healthy equilibrium between the instincts and impulses of the readers. The new critics, as the 20th century advanced, especially after the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, the most potent single influence was that of the, quote, new critics, unquote, stop. The term was first used by J. Spingarn, Spingarn, And though the new criticism had its origin in the writings of T.E. Hume, it is now mainly an American movement. Its chief exponents in America are Kenneth Burke, John Crow Ransom, Alan Tate, Richard Blackmore, Clent Brooks, etc. In England, its leading representatives are I.A. Richards, T.S. Eliot, F.R. Lewis, and William Empson. Para. The new critics are opposed to the biographical, historical, sociological, and comparative approach of conventional criticism. All such considerations are regarded as extrinsic and irrelevant, and a work of art is judged solely on its own merits. A poem, a piece of literature, is the thing in itself with a definite entity of its own, separate both from the poet and the sociocultural milieu in which it is produced. The emphasis is laid on the study of the text and its word-by-word analysis and interpretation. The music of a poem, its imagery and versification, its total structure must be taken into account to arrive at its meaning. Words must be studied with reference to their sound and their emotional and symbolic significance. New criticism is predominantly textual, and the new critics have rendered valuable service to literature by their study and interpretation of literary classics. While Eliot has his affinity with the critics of the new school, he is against too close a scrutiny of a work of art. The poem is the thing, and it must be studied in itself, but he is against the, quote, lemon squeezer, unquote, critics who press the words too closely. Para. While it is too early to assess the worth and significance of the new critics, who today hold the field, there can be no denying that they have raised the standards of literary discussion and opened our promising vistas. The Impressionistic and Romantic School. Para. The Impressionistic critics are concerned with recording their personal impression when they are in contact with a given work of art, quote, without attempting to generalize or draw inferences, unquote, stop. Quote, criticism, unquote, says an Impressionistic critic, M. Jules, Jules, Lemaitre, Lemaitre, quote, whatever be its pretensions, can never go beyond defining the impression which, at a given moment is made on us by a work of art wherein the artist has himself recorded the impression he received from the world at a certain hour. Stop, unquote. The Impressionistic critics are impatient of all dogmas and processes of labeling and codification. Thus, they are, in a sense, quote, romantic, unquote, in their attitude. The most important of Impressionistic Romantic critics is John Middleton Murray, who waged for years in his journal, the Adelphi, Adelphi, a debate on behalf of what he called the, quote, inner voice, unquote, and, quote, romanticism, unquote, against the, quote, classicism, unquote, of T.S. Eliot. The sociological critics. The 20th century also saw the emergence of a group of critics who emphasize the sociological context in the study of a work of literature or even art in general. Most of them are avowed Marxists, and their approach to literature, therefore, is propagandist and prejudiced. Quote, they, unquote, as René Wellek, Wellek, says, in Theory of Literature, quote, tell us not only what were and are the social relations and implications of an author's work, but what they should have been or ought to be. They are not only students of literature and society, but prophets of the future, monitors, propagandists, colon. and they have difficulty in keeping these two functions separate, stop unquote. The sociological approach, both Marxist and anti-Marxist, has many more adherents in America than England. Christopher Caldwell, Raymond Williams, Lionel Trilling, Edmund Wilson, W. H. Auden, and Stephen Spender are some of the most important critics whose critical approach is markedly sociological. The Marxian critic of today is Terry Eagleton. Page 345. The Moralists, para. Now we come to a group of literary critics of the 20th century whom Watson classifies as, quote, the moralist, stop unquote. They include D. H. Lawrence, George Orwell, even F. R. Lewis, and Murray, with some others of less importance. The moralists are occupied with the problem of discriminating between good and bad in literature. They lack, however, the certitude of Dr. Johnson and the past critics of his ilk. Watson says, colon, quote, modern moralism, by contrast, is more often agnostic, exploratory, and self-consciously elitist, colon. Its tone is not that of the common preacher anticipating assent, colon. It is more often embittered and embattled, stop unquote. D. H. Lawrence, who in Lewis's opinion was the greatest literary critic of the 20th century, fought in his novels a savage battle against the taboos of society, civilization, and Christianity. He brought something of the same fighting spirit to his critical works. The moralists are all fighters and disciple makers, even when they find much difficulty in their way. They despise hoity-toity behavior, says Watson, quote, George Orwell, aggressively pouring his tea into his saucer in the BBC canteen may be taken as the eternal model of the modern English moralist, stop unquote. The influence of the moralists is, however, now on the wane, W-A-N-E, though what they, particularly D. H. Lawrence, had to say is of the same significance today as it was when it was said. Eliot and Lewis, para. T.S. Eliot was the most influential of the American-born literary critics of the 20th century. In his critical works, he has thrown out, to quote G. S. Fraser, quote, a number of suggestive or disturbing ideas often compressed into a single phrase that have fertilized the thinking of other critics, stop. Empson has wittily described him as a penetrating and inescapable influence, rather like an east wind, stop unquote. His views regarding tradition versus the individual talent, poetic drama, impersonality in poetry, the, quote, dissociation of sensibility, unquote, and 100 other themes and problems have to be taken cognizance of by every literary commentator worth the name. Much of Eliot's literary criticism is indeed an extension of his poetry workshop, for it deals with the issues he has to tackle as a poet. However, it has proved to be of much wider significance. Such 20th century literary phenomena as the, quote, revival, unquote, of Donne and Dryden and the devaluation of Milton, and such vogues as that of the placement of every writer and every writing with reference to tradition, and that of the appreciation and admiration of, quote, difficult, unquote, poetry, is mainly from T.S. Eliot. The new critics also acknowledge their debt, D-E-B-T, to Eliot, para. F. R. Lewis is a controversial disciple of Eliot. He is to be acknowledged, however, as the most influential of the British-born literary critics of the 20th century. No doubt he later quarrelled with even Eliot and rather spitefully affirmed that Lawrence was a better critic than he, but Eliot's influence on him cannot be denied. Lewis is so influential that, to quote Watson, quote, there are probably few departments of English in the Commonwealth which do not boast, or conceal, at least one disciple, stop, unquote. His disparagement of Milton and Shelley and exaltation of Pope and Marvell have wrought a change in the critical thinking of his day. Among the English novelists, he points out Jane Austen, George Eliot, Henry James, Conrad, and Lawrence as the ones who make up, quote, the great tradition, unquote, stop. Lewis is extremely adept at verbal analysis, which, however, is not his usual, not to say the only method. His approach is fundamentally that of a moralist who is carefully looking for reverence to life. G.S. Fraser says, quote, the quality of life is what Lewis is primarily interested in, and in literature as serving that, but he is a moralist who refuses to generalize, stop, unquote. Lewis's energetic responsiveness, his penetrative analysis, and intellectual alacrity are his great assets, but his rigidness and pontifical self-aggrandizement cannot be defended. Among his disciples, the most important are David Deutsch and L.C. Knights, Knights, a really great critic in his own right, not to speak of the numerous band who wrote for Scrutiny, S. capital, para. As regards literary criticism, the scene today at the beginning of the 21st century is a very confused one incapable of being reduced even to a semblance of order. We face a whole welter of literary theories and critical approaches. All of them make up a formidable body of literary aesthetics, but we have to wait long for their profitable application to actual literary works. Stop.